Richard Lawson sat in his study late at night, the glow of the desk lamp catching the deep lines carved into his face. To the world, he was a billionaire industrialist, a man who had built factories, bought companies, and accumulated more wealth than most people could imagine. But to himself, he was simply a father, a man who had poured his soul into raising his only son, Daniel, after his wife had passed away years ago. Daniel had recently announced his engagement to Emily, a beautiful and intelligent young woman who seemed perfect on the surface. Yet Richard's heart wrestled with a nagging doubt. He had seen too many people drawn to him because of his fortune. What if Emily was no different? What if she loved the lifestyle more than she loved his son? That question ate at him, keeping him awake through the silence of the night. Richard had never been afraid of ruthless competitors or hostile takeovers, but this uncertainty shook him. His son's happiness was more valuable than his entire empire, and he would do anything to protect it. He needed to know the truth. And so, he devised a plan, one that would take him far away from his boardrooms and into the disguise of a man no one would notice. The following week, Richard transformed himself. He traded his tailored suits for worn-out overalls, scuffed work boots, and a cap that shadowed his face. He let his gray beard grow rough and unkempt. He smeared dust and grease on his hands and learned to move slowly, as though the weight of years bent his back. When he looked at himself in the mirror, he hardly recognized the man staring back. No longer a billionaire, he now looked like a poor, weary gatekeeper, someone invisible to the world. That afternoon, Richard took his place at the iron gates of his own mansion. The guards and staff, carefully instructed, played along with the charade. He sat on a wooden stool, a rusty thermos at his side, his shoulders slumped as though burdened by a life of struggle. It wasn't long before Emily arrived. A black sedan pulled up, sleek and polished, and Emily stepped out, carrying a bouquet of fresh flowers. She looked radiant, her dress simple but elegant, her posture filled with grace. Richard's sharp eyes, hidden beneath his disguise, studied her every move. As she approached, Richard purposely fumbled with the heavy chain on the gate. His hands trembled, and he let out a pained sigh as though the effort was too much for him. He wanted to see, would she notice? Would she care? Or would she walk past, annoyed at the inconvenience? To his surprise, Emily's steps quickened. "Oh no, sir, let me help you," she said gently, setting the flowers carefully on the hood of the car before rushing to his side. She grasped the chain with both hands and pulled, her slender arms straining against the weight until the gate creaked open. Richard watched her closely. There was no irritation on her face, no trace of superiority. Instead, there was genuine concern in her eyes. "Thank you, miss," Richard muttered in a gravelly voice, lowering his gaze. But Emily didn't leave it at that. She picked up the flowers again and turned back toward him. "You look exhausted," she said softly. "Have you been working all day?" Richard swallowed the lump in his throat. Long hours," he replied, feigning the accent of a tired old worker. Without hesitation, Emily reached into her purse and pulled out a small bottle of water. "Here, please drink this. It's too hot to be out here without resting." She pressed it into his hand as though it were the most natural thing in the world. Then, instead of walking away toward the mansion, she sat beside him on the weathered bench by the gate. For several minutes, she asked him about his life, where he was from, whether he had family. Richard made up a simple story of being a poor man who had worked all his life as a gatekeeper. Emily listened intently, her eyes never wandering, her smile never fading. She laughed softly when he joked about the mischievous squirrels that often stole food from his lunchbox, and she frowned with sympathy when he spoke of aches in his knees. "You remind me of my grandfather," Emily said finally, her voice touched with tenderness. "He used to tell me that no matter how rich or powerful people became, they were all human at the end of the day. And it's our duty to treat everyone with kindness." Richard's chest tightened. He had expected politeness at best, indifference at worst. But this was compassion untainted by expectation. Emily had no idea she was speaking to the man who owned the estate she stood on. To her, he was just a tired old worker, yet she treated him with dignity, respect, and warmth. When a servant from the house came to escort her inside, Emily rose but not before gently patting Richard's arm. "Take care of yourself, sir," she said. "Don't push yourself too hard. Health is more precious than anything else. Richard sat frozen long after she disappeared through the gates. His hands, still holding the water bottle she had given him, trembled, not with age, but with emotion. For years, he had trusted money more than people, building walls of suspicion around his heart. But in that moment, he realized something profound: kindness cannot be faked. He had seen it in Emily's eyes, felt it in her words, and experienced it in her actions. As the evening sun dipped below the horizon, Richard wiped away the tear that had escaped his eye. His disguise had not only revealed the truth about his son's fiancée but also reminded him of something he had nearly forgotten: that wealth could buy many things, but not the purity of a kind heart. The next evening, the Lawson mansion was alive with quiet anticipation. A dinner had been arranged, one meant to celebrate Daniel and Emily's engagement. The long oak dining table gleamed under the chandelier's golden light, the scent of roasted herbs and fresh bread filling the air. Staff moved gracefully about the room, setting crystal glasses and polishing silverware. Yet at the head of the table, Richard Lawson sat in silence, his mind still echoing with the memory of Emily's kindness at the gate the day before. He had planned to reveal himself tonight, not just as Daniel's father, but as the same gatekeeper Emily had helped. The thought made his chest heavy. What if her kindness had been a fleeting gesture, one she would deny when faced with the truth? But Richard had always believed in courage, and tonight he needed to summon it, not for a business deal, but for his family's future. Daniel and Emily arrived together, their laughter bright as they stepped into the grand hall. Daniel looked proud, his arm linked with Emily's, his eyes filled with a joy Richard had rarely seen. Emily wore a modest dress, pale blue, her hair flowing softly over her shoulders. She greeted the staff with the same warmth she had shown the old gatekeeper, smiling at each person as though they mattered. Richard noticed. He noticed everything. Dinner began with light conversation. Daniel spoke of his plans for the future, Emily shared stories from her childhood, and Richard listened, his heart swelling. Yet beneath his calm exterior, he was restless. Finally, as the main course was served, he cleared his throat. The room quieted instantly. Richard set down his glass, his eyes fixed on Emily. "There is something I must share," he began, his voice steady but weighted with emotion. "Emily, yesterday, before you came to dinner, you met a man at the gates of this house. Do you remember him?" Emily looked puzzled for a moment before her face softened with recognition. "Yes, the gatekeeper, an older gentleman. I hope he's all right. He seemed so tired." Richard drew a slow breath, his heart pounding. "That man was me." A hush fell over the room. Daniel's eyes widened, and Emily's lips parted in shock. The silence stretched, heavy with disbelief, until Richard removed his glasses and set them aside, letting the mask drop. "I needed to know if you cared for my son, or for the wealth attached to his name. So I disguised myself as someone invisible, someone you had no reason to impress. And what I saw," his voice broke, his eyes brimming with tears. "What I saw moved me more than anything in my lifetime of riches." Emily blinked rapidly, her hand trembling as she placed it on the table. But instead of recoiling, instead of showing anger or humiliation, she smiled softly. "Mr. Lawson," she said gently, "kindness doesn't change depending on who's watching. To me, he was a man who needed help. That was enough." Her words pierced through Richard's doubts like sunlight breaking through clouds. He felt a tear slide down his cheek, unashamed in front of them both. All his fears, that Emily might be shallow, that she might be with Daniel for the Lawson fortune, vanished in that moment. What remained was a simple, undeniable truth. His son had chosen a woman of integrity, a woman who valued people above possessions. Daniel reached across the table, taking Emily's hand with pride shining in his eyes. "Dad," he said quietly, "now you see what I've seen all along." Richard's chest swelled with emotion. For years, he had been surrounded by people who measured him by his wealth. Rarely had he met someone who looked past it. And now, his son had found someone who didn't just look past it, she didn't see it at all. She saw the person, the humanity. Rising from his chair, Richard lifted his glass. His hand trembled, but not from age. From gratitude. "To Emily," he said, his voice thick with tears. "You've shown me that love and kindness are the rarest treasures of all. My empire, my fortune, none of it compares to the wealth of knowing my son has found someone like you." The staff, though silent, exchanged glances filled with admiration. Daniel's face glowed with pride, and Emily lowered her gaze, touched by the sincerity in Richard's words. The clink of glasses filled the room as they toasted, but Richard felt something much greater than a celebration. He felt redemption. As the meal went on, laughter replaced the earlier tension. Richard found himself telling stories he hadn't shared in years, about Daniel as a little boy, about the days when the Lawson fortune was still being built brick by brick. Emily listened with the same attentiveness she had shown the old gatekeeper, her eyes warm and her smile genuine. Later that night, when the guests had gone and the house had grown quiet, Richard lingered in the dining room. He stood by the window, gazing out at the iron gates where his test had begun. He thought of the moment Emily had handed him water, her eyes filled with compassion for a man she thought had nothing. He thought of her sitting beside him, treating him like he mattered. And he thought of her words at the table, words that would stay with him forever: kindness doesn't change depending on who's watching. For a man who had spent decades surrounded by wealth, power, and ambition, the lesson struck him deeply. Money could build empires, but it could not build trust. Power could move nations, but it could not move hearts. Only kindness, simple, selfless kindness, had the power to do both. Richard turned from the window, a smile tugging at his lips. For the first time in a long time, he felt at peace. His son's future was in good hands. His heart, once guarded and suspicious, had been cracked open by the simple generosity of a young woman who treated a stranger with dignity. That night, as Richard extinguished the lights and let the mansion settle into silence, he whispered to himself, "I am the richest man alive, not because of what I own, but because of what my family has found."